Thanksgiving is something that's been on all of our minds, I'm sure, a lot this past week, and I hope that it's not something that stops being on your mind. I hope that you take not just that one week and that one Thursday to spend time being thankful for all that God has done, but that you'll carry that same attitude and that same gratitude all throughout your year. One of the greatest blessings that God has given us that I'm thankful for is His family. Wherever we go, you can find, if you can find believers, then you can find family. So one of the things I'm most thankful for is the family of God. One of the things I'm most thankful for today is the family of God right here at Wilsonville. It's a blessing to be here, and I'm thankful to Billy and to Dennis and the work they do as shepherds and watching over the flock and protecting and guiding and guarding, and I'm just so thankful for them and for the blessing they are to this congregation, the hard, challenging work that they take on, the often thankless work that they take on. But our prayers, my prayers are with you. I'm thankful for all of our deacons who labor and serve in many different capacities. You work behind the scenes. Oftentimes the things you do go unnoticed, but I'm thankful for you. I pray God's blessings on you to continue to strengthen you in the service that you offer this congregation and to each and every part. We all have a part to play in the family of God. Just as within a family there is no insignificant individual, so within the family of God there is no insignificant individual. And so may all of us, I'm thankful for you all, but may we all just embrace whatever it is that God has given us to do in service to one another. You may turn in your Bibles, if you would, to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6, we're going to be in that text here in just a few moments. It's 1992 in Barcelona, Summer Olympics. Many of you are probably old enough to remember this. In fact, some of you may have actually seen this, if not while it was happening, this particular race. Certainly, the publicity that it got after the race was over. One of the racers, a man named Redmon, no relation, was preparing for the 400-meter sprint. And gun fires, he takes off, and right there in the middle of the race early on, he pulls his hamstring and he collapses. One can only imagine the pain of that situation. He's been preparing for this moment so much of his life. All of the blood, sweat, and tears, all of the sacrifice, the training, the preparation seems to have been lost. But he's determined to finish the race, and so he gets up and begins to hobble along when all of a sudden there's a shuffle from behind. Someone's broken through security and is running onto the track, the racetrack. And he runs up beside him, and he puts his arm up underneath him, and it turns out to be, probably a lot of you know this, his father, Jim Redmon, who helps him finish his race around the track. This morning I want to talk about burden bearing. Let's read together in Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Brethren, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each one will have to bear his own load. What is a burden? If you think about it just in the Greek word, it simply means something very simple. It's a load that someone carries. It's a weight that they may be bearing. Here in this context, as we read about it, though, it sounds like it's something that weighs somebody down. Kind of like that fellow there is carrying that burden on his back. It's something that weighs you down, that makes your walk with the Lord more difficult and harder. And I think in this context, Paul is speaking most directly about sin, because he goes on to talk about a person who is overcome by sin, who is caught up in transgression. Maybe you've been caught in transgression. Maybe you've been bearing the burden of sin in your past. Certainly we all have. Maybe it's on something of an occasional level. Maybe you struggle with telling the truth, being honest with those around you, and that's a burden that you find yourself carrying, just struggling being honest with others. Or maybe it's something more frequent. Maybe you struggle with profanity. Maybe you struggle with lust. Maybe you struggle with pride. Some sin of that nature where you're constantly carrying this burden. You're constantly being tempted by the devil to give into that particular sin. Or maybe it's something stronger than just a sin that occurs from time to time. Maybe it's an addictive type sin. Sin that has overpowered you. You know, Paul in Romans chapter 6, speaking of sin, talks about it wants to be our master. It wants to overthrow us. It wants to rule in our life. And oftentimes this is what addictive sin does. And so maybe this morning you are dealing with sin that's of an addictive nature where you are caught and you are overpowered. You are enslaved. And the term here Paul uses in Galatians, you're caught. I kind of see an animal that's in a trap. It wants to get out, but it cannot by its own power. It's stuck. And if you've ever been involved with addictive sin, then you know the feeling of what it's like to be stuck in that trap, to be caught up and unable and powerless to get out. Maybe you're bearing a burden of this nature this morning, but I want to talk about it from a broader perspective, and we'll look at some narrow application, but from a broader perspective, there's many kind of burdens that we bear. Maybe you're bearing the burden of illness. Maybe it's acute, maybe it's momentary and hopefully short-lived, or maybe it's long-term. I know many in this congregation, you've been on the sick list since I've been here. You've been on the sick list long before I got here. You've been struggling with illness that will not go away. Maybe you've been told that the illness you have will not go away. There is no cure for it. Maybe all of us who are healthy can take a moment to appreciate what kind of burden and how that might burden someone's soul. Maybe you deal with perpetual pain. Maybe you deal with worry. Maybe you find yourself discouraged by the circumstances of your life, by the circumstances of people you love. Maybe you're caught in the addiction of sin and you're dealing with perpetual guilt because you keep returning and you keep returning and you keep returning and you just can't seem to break free. Maybe you're dealing with loss. Around this holiday season, the pain of loss seems to be accentuated as we remember the special times that we had with people that we loved who are no longer with us. Maybe you're bearing that burden and you're struggling to release that. Maybe you deal with sorrow or anxiety or fear or depression. And on and on and on we could go. So, looking at this, any of you bearing burdens this morning? I am. I think most of us probably look at this and say, 1, 2, 3 or more. I'm carrying around some of these. Reflecting on life, it seems like we probably spend more time bearing burdens than we do being unencumbered by them. Life is filled with burdens, and more often than not, we're probably carrying burdens. But from the challenge of life, and this is, I think, the nature of life in a broken world, but from the challenge of life emerges this beautiful command from Paul where he tells us, Christians, bear one another's burdens. So, different from what the world preaches. The world says if you're dealing with something, get yourself out of it. You cause the problem. You cause the mess. You fix it. You deal with it. Christians are given a very different instruction. We're to look at others who may be struggling, dealing with hardship, bearing burdens, and we are commanded to bear them. That word bear is very simple. It simply means to lift, to take up, to carry. And just a couple minor observances. Let me see if I put these up here. I don't know that I didn't. One, a couple observances about this command to bear one another's burdens. One, we need to understand that bearing someone's burdens don't mean that we carry it for them, but rather that we help them carry it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Secondly, we need to understand that this is not a recommendation. This isn't like the best practices if you want to be a follower of God. This is a command where we have the responsibility. We prayed, and Luke prayed this morning, thanking God for the blessing of the church. And this is one of the greatest blessings we have as part of being a part of the family of God, is that we're not in this thing alone. And when we're overcome or when we're weighed down, that there are in this room 85, 90 other people who will come alongside you and who will walk beside you and who will take the weight that you're bearing and they will help you carry it. That's one of the blessings of being part of the family of God. That's something we have to do for one another. It's not something you're given the option to do if you want. Commanded, bear one another's burdens. And then third, this term, command, bear one another's burdens. If you like English, it's in the present active imperative tense. That means it's an ongoing process. It's not just something you do one time and done. We like one and done stuff. I've done this, I've fulfilled my responsibility, now I can get on with other things. That's not the case. Bear one another's burdens. This is something that we're actively to be engaging in as long as we are going to walk with the Lord. It's not a one and done thing. And so when you put all of this together, what you've got is you've got someone who is struggling along, bearing some sort of burden, physical, emotional, spiritual, and one comes along and bears up beneath them and helps them carry that burden. You're bringing some sort of relief, you're bringing comfort, you're bringing strength to a challenging situation. And the significance of this is when we bear one another's burdens, we're fulfilling the law of Christ. We're going to talk about the law of Christ, I'm confident, in our 1 John class. I'm sure Andrew will be telling us a lot more about that. But the law of Christ is rooted in love. Love for one another, love for God. And when we bear one another's burdens, what we're doing is we are fulfilling the law of Jesus. And don't you know that it has to please the Lord? And this should incite within all of us a great desire to grow as burden bearers. Now, here's a hard reality that some of us struggle to acknowledge. We all need help from time to time. For some of us, asking for help is no big deal. It's a small thing. It's easy for us to do. But for some of us, you know who you are, asking for help is hard. But the reality is, no one should feel that way because we all have challenges from time to time. One of the things burdens do is they allow others who have been gifted by the Lord to come and stand alongside us and utilize their gift to bring relief and comfort to us. And so they're using gifts that God has given them to build up the body. But burdens also remind us that we can't do life on our own. We can't get through this thing on our own. We can't serve the Lord the way that we should on our own. We're going to need help. And if you think about some of the greatest saints and the greatest people in Scripture, you find out they were people who suffered under great burdens as well, and they weren't afraid to ask for help. There was one occasion where the children of Israel, you remember, were fighting against the Amalekites, and as long as Moses would hold his hands up in the air, the Israelites would be winning the battle. But if you ever try to hold your hands up in the air for long, and I know the Bible class teachers, you've probably done this with your kids, is see how long you can hold your hands up in the air. Doesn't take long before just the weight of your hands gets tired. And they'd been going at it for all day. And Moses was exhausted, and his hands began to droop, and as they drooped, the children of Israel began to lose the battle. And so two men, Aaron and Hur, came to help bear that burden of keeping Moses' hands in the air. And they held his arms up so that although Moses' strength was exhausted, he had help. He had people who were helping him bear that burden, and Israel was able to win the day against Amalek. Think about Elijah, the sole prophet of God. We think of him as this great man of God, and he was, but he had some low moments where he was struggling with depression, when he thought he was the only one that was faithfully serving the Lord. He kind of just gives up hope and says, you know what, Lord, just take my life. I'm no better than my fathers who are gone. I just can't take it anymore. He became depressed. And the Lord strengthens him and encourages him, but then he sends him to get a protege, if you will, Elisha, who he's going to pour into and invest into, and who's going to help strengthen him, and who's going to help him through that challenging season of his life. And then there's Jesus. Jesus was sorrowful there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he says to three of his apostles, Peter, James, and John, and we're going to read this later. It's very meaningful. But he says, come and pray with me. And then we know as Jesus was carrying his cross to the place where he was to be crucified, he was exhausted. He collapsed. The cross fell on him. And so they had to get somebody from the crowd, Simon the Cyrenian, to come and to bear the cross of Jesus. We all have burdens. We're all going to need help. We need to be able to admit and acknowledge that. And so what I want to talk about this morning is maybe you hear this from one of two ways. Hopefully you hear this sermon holistically. You hear the whole thing. But maybe you hear it from the perspective of, I need to be willing to share my burdens and allow others to help me and assist me when I'm going through difficult times. But the big application that I want to make is to look at some things that will equip us to be better burden bearers. I don't want to try to say that again. But how can I, as a Christian, more aptly fulfill what Paul has commanded us to bear one another's burdens? What are some of the characteristics? What are some of the things that I need to work on? And so we want to look this morning at the portrait of a burden bearer. The older I get, the more involved I get plugged into people's lives as I've gotten to know some of you, and as I get to know other Christians in other places, and as I talk to just people that aren't Christians, that don't have the Lord and don't have that relationship with Him. I realize how hard people's lives are. how broken people's lives are. Sometimes it's a consequence of their own sins, bad decisions that they've made. They're having to reap some of the things that they've sown. Sometimes it's just a consequence of living in a broken world. Life is hard. And when you get to know people and you plug into their life and you get beyond the formalities of, hey there, how you doing, good to see you, what you find out is life is hard and people are bearing burdens every day. And so this is a word for all of us. I know some of us possess a more natural temperament, if you will, to perhaps fulfill this particular command. But understand, this applies to all of us. And God takes us, I think, sometimes through the school of suffering and affliction to equip us uniquely for this task. And this is a favorite passage of mine. I've read it several occasions here. But Paul said, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so there's a reason God gives us comfort from affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort which we ourselves are comforted by God." And so going through hardship allows us to be a better burden bearer. And so whether you're naturally gifted in this way, perhaps you find it easier to bear one another's burdens by virtue of your personality or the gifts God has given you, or whether you struggle. We've all got this responsibility, and so I want us to look at some things that will help make us better burden bearers. First thing is we need to have a sensitive awareness of others. Some people they have an eye for people that are struggling. It's almost like a sixth sense where they can just look at someone, and maybe from the outside you can't tell anything's wrong, but they can just look at someone and they can know that something is wrong. Romans chapter 12, 6 through 8, Paul kind of alludes to that. I've taken several of these things he's mentioned out just to highlight what I want us to see. But speaking about gifts that God gives His people for serving the body, having these gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. And then he speaks of one specifically I want to bring to our attention, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. It seems to me there are certain people who are just uniquely gifted to be able to perform these acts of mercy, to look at others and know that they're struggling, and they're just able to say the perfect thing or do the perfect thing or just be a presence in that person's life to strengthen them and help them when they're in a challenging situation. Yeah, but we all need at the same time, whether we have this naturally or not, we all need to learn to be more sensitive and aware to those who are going on around us. I looked up online for a word or two regarding just an awareness for other people, an awareness for our brethren, and I couldn't find a thing on it. But what I found a bunch of articles about is just self-awareness. We need to be self-aware. And yes, there is some sense in which we all need to understand and know ourselves in order to more faithfully serve the Lord. But at the same time, I think that represents a struggle that a lot of us have. We can get so caught up in ourselves. We can get so caught up in our own problems, what's going on in our life, what it is we're trying to do, that we can completely forget to look at the life of others and to realize, hey, there's people out there that are struggling far worse than I am. And so to be an effective burden bearer, we're going to have to look beyond ourselves. And Jesus, who's the ultimate burden bearer, and we're going to reference Him as an example on several occasions, is set before us by Paul as the example. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. Let each of you not only look out for his own interests, but also the interests of others. And so Paul's not saying you should just neglect yourself. That can be dangerous too. But at the same time, he kind of sets up an order here. He says, let each of us be more concerned about others and their well-being than our own. And so often it's selfish ambition that drives us. What's good for me? That's what I'm focusing my thoughts on, my time on, my money on. What's good for me? What does Zach need? My well-being, my benefit, my advancement. But is anybody not convicted by that phrase? Count others more significant than yourself? Look out for the interest of others. Jesus had an awareness for those who were often overlooked by the majority. There were certain types of people back during the days of Jesus that they were considered second class by society. And yes, it was absolutely wrong. We would never endorse this kind of practice or this kind of attitude. But there were certain people that were just by the Jews, especially the Jewish men, that were looked down on as lesser, as inferior. The tax collectors were a group that were looked down on. They were hated by the Jews. Prostitutes, Gentiles, women. They were all looked at as second class, and that's not right. That was absolutely wrong. But when you follow Jesus' ministry, particularly through Luke's gospel, I find that interesting because he highlights those who are often looked down on and overlooked. He highlights Jesus' interaction with these broken people, with the people that were looked down on, with the ones who were overlooked by the majority. But to see others, we've got to be willing to look beyond our own circumstances and our own struggles. Just think about it. If each of us looked out for ourselves, what was best for me, we'd all have one person looking out for us. But if every one of us looked out for others, we'd all have, 75, 80 people looking out for us? That's what Paul's calling us to do. That's what it is to be a burden bearer. And maybe I'll offer this special word. I've noticed in every church I've been a part of, there's a group, a family or two or three or four, that kind of live on the fringe. Maybe it's because their attendance is infrequent and they're not here as regularly. Maybe it's because they can't contribute much. Not necessarily in a monetary sense, but maybe they just can't contribute much or don't contribute much to the congregation. Maybe it's because they're not popular or well-known or well-liked. Maybe it's because they're socially awkward. If we have these people here, can I encourage us to make a special effort to reach out to them? Because they, in particular, they perhaps more than the rest of us need help, need their burdens borne, and maybe that would strengthen them. Maybe that would encourage them. Maybe by just pouring the love of God into them, they would be brought into the center of the fold, and they would be strengthened, and they would be encouraged, and better equipped in that process to serve the Lord. But God help us to get our eyes off of ourselves and to look at others and to be searching for those who may be dealing with hardships, who may be bearing burdens. We've got to have the sensitive awareness for others. Secondly, we've got to have a willingness to get our hands dirty, okay? Because burden bearing is dirty work. And sadly, many Christians just don't want to get their hands dirty. Remember the parable that Jesus tells of the Good Samaritan, where you got these two upstanding Jewish citizens, a Levite and a priest, and they're traveling along, and as they see this man who's laying there in great need on the verge of death, they cross by on the other side. They've got important work to be doing. They don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to get involved with somebody else's problems. Peter, remember when Jesus is going along and he's there in the upper room in John 13 and he's washing the apostles' feet, and they're confused when they see Jesus, their Lord, the Messiah, put on the garb of a servant and start washing everyone's feet. And he gets to Peter, and remember what Peter says? Lord, you're never going to wash my feet. You ever wonder why Peter says that? I'll tell you one of the reasons why I think Peter said that. Because if Jesus washed his feet, he knew he was going to have to wash other people's feet. Peter didn't want to do that. Peter didn't want to get his hands dirty having to wash people's feet. Remember, he wanted to sit at the right and at the left. He wanted to be there ruling there beside the Messiah. And so when he said, you're not washing my feet, Lord, I think it's because Peter didn't want to wash feet. Peter didn't want to get his hands dirty. Peter didn't want to get down in the trenches. Maybe that's us. Maybe we don't want to get involved in other people's lives and other people's problems because we don't want to get our hands dirty. Look, my life is hard enough as it is. I don't need more. I don't need a greater burden than what I'm already bearing. Or maybe that's not what burdens us. Maybe we're worried that by getting involved, particularly with those who are entrenched in sin, whether they be in the church or whether they be in the world, maybe we're concerned. We don't want to be around sinners because I don't want that sort of sinful influence on my life. I don't want to hear the language of the world. I don't want to be exposed to the lifestyle of the world. I don't want the immorality around me. Maybe that's a sense in which we kind of push back from those who are steeped in sin, those who are struggling. I've got a question I want you to think about. Would sinners want to be around you? Would sinners want to be around you? Some might answer, I sure hope not, because I'm nothing like them. If that's you, I want you to think about this. Speaking of Jesus, Luke writes, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. Who did Jesus go out of his way to spend time with? Tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, people with messy lives, people with problems. Understand, not all sinners are created equal. Some sinners have hard hearts. They dwell continually on evil. They want absolutely nothing to do with anything good. That's not the kind of sinners I'm talking about when I say would sinners want to be around you. And that's not the kind of sinners that came around Jesus. Not every person is lost in sin like that. Many are lost. Their lives are ruined because of terrible choices they've made, maybe in ignorance, or maybe just the circumstances that they found themselves in. Maybe they were just weak and they made bad decisions, and it really messed up their life. But they're looking for a way out. They're looking for they're trying to fill the void of emptiness inside of them that sex and drugs and alcohol cannot and will not fill. Those are the kind of sinners that were coming to Jesus. The kind of sinners that should be comfortable around us. And there's a sense in which we should be able to say yes to that question. Sinners should feel comfortable around us. Not in the sense that we don't talk about sin and we don't speak about the need for repentance, but it's that we help lift the burdens that they carry. It's that we don't look down on them with a condescending, holier-than-thou attitude. They sense we have a genuine care for them and their soul, and we provide relief for them, and we point them to the great burden bearer, Jesus. If we're going to be an effective burden bearer, we've got to be willing to get our hands dirty because people have messy lives. Christians have messy lives. And let me mention this because this is important. On the one hand, we are called to be lights in the world, to go out in the world of darkness and to be lights. And that's going to require us to go into some pretty dark places. Okay? Being a light is going to require us to go in some dark places. On the other hand, we don't want darkness to rub off on us. And we're warned repeatedly throughout Scripture about the danger of evil companions and what happens if you walk around, or among those who are evil. So how do you harmonize this? We've got to go in dark places to be a light, but we don't want sin and wickedness and evil influence to rub off on us. How do we harmonize that? Well, Paul tells us there in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, brothers, if anyone's caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual, restore him in a spiritual spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you also be tempted. So we've got to go and be lights in the world. We're going to find ourselves in dark places. We can't say, I'm just going to stay in this safe little spot of my church building and my family because I don't want to be contaminated by the influence of sin. We can't be contaminated by the influence of sin, but you can't be a light in the world if that's the attitude that you've got. The way that you deal with that and reconcile resisting the influence of the world is this idea of spiritual strength. Honestly, not everyone is to go off and to be exposed to darkness and sin at a high level and a high frequency. That's why Paul says if someone's caught in sin, there's a certain type of person that needs to go and to help them. It's not the weak. It's not the young. It's not the easily influenced. It's the strong. Okay? And shouldn't that give us all a reason to strive for greater spiritual strength? Because we want to be able to go into the world and rescue those who are stuck in darkness. If you think about this idea of a rescue mission, and that's what it is. We're talking about a rescue mission here. Think about professionals who do life-saving work, lifeguards, policemen, firefighters. You don't just take somebody and push them into one of those intense situations where great harm can occur if they make the wrong move for themselves and for others. It's with much training and preparation and investing time and skills and knowledge in them that we prepare them for that situation so that they'll be able to handle it wisely and effectively. Thus it is whenever we talk about going into these dark places and being a light and getting involved in the life of those who are burdened down with sin. We don't just send anybody. It's those who are strong who are to go. Why? Because as Paul says, you've got to watch out. Because if you go, you may find yourself caught up in sin of another kind or sin of the person that you're trying to help. And it's a vital work that needs to be done. And it's not about making friends with the world. It's about going on this rescue mission. It's about saving others. But this should motivate us all to grow in our spiritual strength so that we can be involved in going and helping those who are caught up in sin and those who are in darkness and pointing them to Jesus. And so it's going to require this willingness to get our hands dirty. It's also going to require a compassionate and not critical heart. What comes to mind when you see another Christian struggling? What's your attitude toward those who are spiritually weak, particularly if you think they should be stronger? You think they should have progressed further by now. What's your attitude toward them? Here's what I have to war against. Pride. Condescension, impatience, being judgmental. How could they be so weak? They've been a Christian how long? how they keep getting themselves in the same situation? How many times have they committed that sin? Why do they keep succumbing? And this is especially tempting if you think your walk with the Lord is good. It's easy to have those attitudes that we shouldn't. But do you know who that sounds like? I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like other men. That's that selfish, prideful, holier, I'm better, judgmental mentality. That's what it sounds like. And again, Galatians 6:1, where we've been spending much of our time, you've got this person who's caught in a transgression, and those who are spiritual should restore them. But Paul doesn't just say restore them. He specifies a way in which the restoration is to take place. He says it's to be done with a spirit of gentleness. It has to be done with gentleness in contrast to harshness and severity. Why? Well, imagine that you're low. Imagine that you're weak. Imagine that you're beat down and somebody says to you, you just need to get yourself straightened out. You need to get your big boy pants on, and we've had enough of how you're acting, and you're on the fast track to hell, and you better straighten out your act. Now, that might motivate a few people that are crushed in spirit and caught in sin. But with most people, that's just going to be the final blow. That's going to crush them. There are times when you might need that kind of severity to shake someone up, but the divine prescription for those who are broken and for those who are beaten down is they're to be restored with gentleness and with patience and with compassion. 1 Thessalonians 5:14, we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. And so you've kind of got there three types of people. You've got the idle or the obstinate. They're the hard-hearted person. And Paul says, that person you do need to admonish. You do need to give them a kick in the seat of the pants. So they're so blinded by their sin, they may need to hear the harshness and severity of their situation in order for them to wake up. Encouraging them and nudging them in the right direction is not going to help them. But then you've got the faint-hearted. They're just overcome. Maybe by their circumstances, maybe by sin. And you got the weak, those that just, they don't have the strength. And you handle them with gentleness. You handle them with encouragement. And that idea of encouragement is it's similar to that of bearing one another's burdens. It's coming alongside someone else. That's what we're told to do with those who are faint-hearted and with those who are weak, all the while being patient with them all. I think about Jesus' encounter with the woman that's caught in adultery in John chapter 8. Plenty of condemnation there in that situation. And was what she was doing wrong? Absolutely. She's caught in the act of adultery, a violation of one of the greatest commandments. She's dishonored her marriage vows, caught in an act that under the old law would have resulted with her execution. Absolutely sinful. But you see the sense in which the Pharisees come. They come with judgment. They come with this critical spirit that they don't care about repentance. They don't care about what's involved. They don't care about the situation that she's in that might have led to that. They've got ulterior motives. Jesus, remember how he deals with her? Very opposite of how the Pharisees do. He deals with her with compassion, and he deals with her with gentleness. He had every right to say, you know what, you should be put to death for what you're doing. It's not what he does. But he's patient, he's compassionate, and he doesn't just let her sin go either. Remember the last thing he says, go and sin no more. You can't continue in this activity. This has got to be put away. But he deals with her in such a compassionate, kind way. She needed compassion. She didn't need condemnation. And it's not that we overlook sin. We give whatever is needed. Maybe we're that shoulder to cry on, or maybe we are a word of rebuke. But we give whatever is needed in that situation. And it's because Christians and churches have possessed such critical and condemning spirits in the past that so many people don't open up about their struggles. Let's be honest. That's a big part of the reason, isn't it? The reason that we're not more forthcoming with, hey, this is what I'm struggling with. Hey, this is sin that I can't seem to shake, is because we're worried others are going to judge us. We're worried they're going to talk about us behind our back. We're worried they're never going to see us the same way again. But we've seen them do it before. It just can't be the way in which we deal with it. Don't bother telling people. I've heard it said, my dad likes to say, don't bother telling people about your problems. Half of them don't care, and the other half are glad that you got them. Gossip and slander and discouragement and judgment and superiority that kind of behavior should not characterize the church. That's the way the world deals with sinners. But that's not how we as Christians are to deal with sinners. We are to be a place of safety. We're to be a place of healing, of compassion, and help. That's how Jesus was. And we're to be that way. And when the occasion calls for it, there is that, more firm admonishment. I'm not saying that we don't do that, because certainly we see Jesus doing that on occasion. But with those who are weak and those who are struggling, those who are burdened and overcome by sin, it's better, it seems, from Scripture to deal with that in a kind, compassionate, patient sort of way. So we need a compassionate, not a critical heart if we're going to be a good burden bearer. We always need to be readily available. You probably figured this out. I'm going to Matthew chapter 9. I'm going to go over there real quick. Needy people have a tendency to come along at the most inopportune time, at the most inconvenient time, don't they? We see such an encounter with Jesus as he's going somewhere very important. In John chapter 9, verse 20, we read about one of these needy people interrupting him. Behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, for she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I'll be made well. Jesus turned and seeing her said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. So Jesus stops what he's doing as he's traveling along, and he's being thronged by this crowd, and he brings the woman to the forefront, and he says, you've been forgiven, you've been cleansed, go your way. And so he stops to kind of deal with this encounter. He could have just let her go. Do you know where Jesus was going when he stopped to speak to this woman and deal with the situation? He was going to the house of a man whose 12-year-old daughter was on the verge of death. But he stops, and he allows himself to be interrupted to compassionately and kindly deal with this woman. Nobody was ever busier than Jesus. I don't know how busy you are, but nobody's ever been busier than Jesus. But nobody's ever been more available than Jesus has either. We need to be willing to be interrupted. It was Christmas Eve 2017, 2 o'clock in the morning. Staying in the little house behind the church in Saratoga, and I wake up to go to the bathroom, and it's been pouring all that evening and at that moment, and water starting to rise up in the bathtub. Just a little bit longer, it's going to flood the floor and then into the living room, the carpet. And so I go get a 5-gallon bucket and start scooping it up and trying to get it out as fast as I can. The only problem is it's coming up faster than I can empty it out. So I called one of my buddies, 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, and said, hey man, I need your help. He was over in 5 minutes. For the next 2 or 3 hours, we carried water out bucket by bucket by bucket to make sure that the house didn't flood, until we were able to get a plumber come out the next day and help take care of it. But needy people aren't going to come along when it's convenient for you. And if the only time that you're willing to help someone is when it aligns with your schedule, you're going to miss many opportunities to bear the burdens of others. Let's hit these last two just real quick and then move on to a couple points of application. If we're going to be a good burden bearer, we must know when to listen, when to speak, and when we speak, we must know what to say. In Proverbs 15:23, to make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good it is. If we're going to be good burden bearers, we know we need to be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just sit down with somebody and not say anything. Just listen. Just be there. Be a presence, be a shoulder for them to cry on. Roger mentioned, and I've observed this before, and Job's friends were great friends when they came and sat with him for 7 days and didn't say a word. But it's when they opened their mouth and started speaking, they made the situation far worse. A word to a person that's broken and crushed by their problems, it may lift that burden from their back, but the wrong word then might in turn be the final thing that crushes their spirits. Ephesians 4:29, let this govern us as we deal in our communication with others who are hurting, and to realize people are going to say things they don't mean whenever they are crushed by the circumstances of life and when things seem hopeless. And we need to allow much of what's said in those moments to just pass by unchallenged. That was the problem with Job's friends. He said things that he probably didn't mean, that in a more sound position of mind, he wouldn't have said. And people are going to do that. Just give them a little grace and be patient. And in your communication with them, let no corrupt talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So if we're going to be a good burden bearer, we need to know when to listen, when to speak, and what to say when we do speak. And then we need to be people that are going to do. It's easy to say, you're hearing this, and you say, hey, I see some deficiencies in my life. I want to get better at this. I hope you're feeling that way. And I hope you're thinking, I want to get better at this, but my question is when? When? Don't let your burden, your desire to be a better burden bearer, just be something that's passing. The church has too many observers and bystanders, thinkers and overthinkers, complainers and gossipers, slanderers and backbiters, questioners and analyzers, commentators and backseat drivers, critics and criticizers, reviewers and evaluators. What it needs more of is burden bearers. That's what burden bearers do. They don't just have good intentions, they act. James 2:15 and 16, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? We can't just have good intentions and say, I want to help others. I'm going to help others. We've actually got to help others. We shouldn't act thoughtlessly. We shouldn't act foolishly. But it must move beyond simple desire and intention. It must move to where we are acting and bringing relief to those who are hurting. So let me offer just a few lessons as we wrap things up and bring them to a close. Thinking about bearing one another's burdens. First off, we need to realize if there are going to be burden bearers, there must also be burden sharers. I'm going to step on some toes here. Some of us don't want to share our burdens. It's not that we don't have them. It's that we just don't want to share them. We want others to think we don't. Why is that? Numerous different reasons. Maybe yours are different from what I've got in mind, but it seems to me so oftentimes the reason we don't share our burdens with others is because of our pride. We don't want to be perceived as weak. We don't want to be perceived as needy. We don't want to be perceived as struggling or sinful. And I understand that some of us are very private, but look real quick to Matthew chapter 26. I said we were going to read this earlier, so I'm going to make good on that. Matthew chapter 26. So here we are at the eve of Jesus' arrest, betrayal, and crucifixion the next day. Matthew 26, and let the power of these words sink into you, the significance of them. So Jesus went with his apostles, verse 36, Matthew 26:36. Jesus went with his apostles to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, he began to be sorrowful and full of trouble. And then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Jesus had a great burden to bear. And in an extent, he could only bear it on his own. But in this moment, he could be helped. And so, the Son of God, the Messiah, the King of Israel, the eternal Word, taking on flesh, bearing this great burden of sorrow, says to these three men, hey, I'm sorrowful to the point of death. Will you come and sit with me? Pray with me and help me bear this burden. If Jesus was willing to humble himself and say, I need help, how can we not? How can we not? James 5:16, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. Maybe some of you might disagree with this. But we don't have to share everything with everybody, but we all need somebody. Find somebody who's trustworthy. Find someone who you can confide in. Find someone who is wise and compassionate. Jesus had Peter, James, and John. And in our sharing of our burdens, we need to be specific. Again, our pride, our ego keeps us from saying, this is what I'm dealing with. Specifically, this is what I'm struggling with. This is the sin that I keep committing. This is what I'm facing. Imagine going to the doctor and saying, doctor says, okay, you're here. What? I didn't see anything on your sheet. What's the matter? I don't know, doc. Something's wrong. Well, I just don't feel good. Well, what's happened? I don't know. Does anything hurt? Is anything broken? What are your symptoms? Listen, until you can tell that doctor some specific things about what you're dealing with, he's not going to have any idea how to treat you and how to get you on the path that's going to result with your healing. Confess your sins. People come forward and they say, I've sinned, or I've got sin in my life. Okay, we've all got sin in our life. What are you dealing with? How can we help you bear your burden? We don't mind asking God for help, but so oftentimes we cut off the means by which God sends help, that is, other people, when we don't share the burdens that we are bearing. And so we need to humble ourselves and be willing to share our burdens. And very quickly, I'd like to go down a longer rabbit trail than I am, but if we're going to be a congregation in a church where people are willing to come and say, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, then we've got to have an attitude, we've got to have a spirit that's going to forgive and be patient and show love and compassion and not gossip and not condemn and not hold it over their head and not forget. We've got to do away with all of those things if we're going to be a place where others are comfortable and safe to say, this is my struggle, this is what I'm bearing. So for there to be burden bearers, there must be burden sharers. Maybe you need to hear that and find someone to open up to and say, these are what the burdens that I'm bearing, and allow others to help you. Secondly, we also need to see that not all burdens can be shared. In Galatians chapter 2, Galatians 6:2 and then 6:5, listen to these two statements. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. But then he says in verse 5, for each one will have to bear his own load. Which one is it? Is it bear one another's burdens or bear your own load? Well, interestingly, in those two verses, the word for burden is two different Greek words. In Galatians 6:2, the burden that we are to share with others and that we can't share with others is that word baros, and it's a burden that can be shared. But in Galatians 6:5, where it says we each must bear our own load, that's a different word, and that's a burden that we must bear on our own. There are burdens that others did not intend for us to bear. You can't bear the burden of someone else's personal salvation. Listen, I've tried to do this in times past, and I found out the hard way, this just simply cannot be done. You can't drag somebody to heaven. You can snatch them from the fire, but you can't drag somebody to heaven against their will. If a person doesn't have the interest in serving the Lord and dedicating their life to God, you can't make them. You've got people, Jesus didn't bear the burden of the Pharisees. They had hardened themselves against God. They'd rejected His Messiah. And Jesus didn't try to bring them to God against their will. He knew that's a burden you can't bear. You can't bear the burden of someone else's personal salvation. You can't bear the burden of somebody who doesn't want to be better. You're trying to help somebody, but if they don't want to be well, they don't want to be better, you're spinning your wheels and there's nothing you could do. They've got to want to be better before they can be helped. That's why John, 4? Where you get, no, it's not 4, 5 maybe. Jesus at the pool of Bethesda, and the man's there, and he's been laying there for 30 years, and he says, do you want to be made well? Strange question to ask a sick man, until you realize not everybody wants to be made well. That's a burden that we can't bear for somebody else. Unless somebody wants to be saved, unless somebody wants to be made well, then you can't bear that burden for them. So we've all got to bear that burden individually. That being said, there are burdens that you must bear, okay? Parents must bear the burden of raising their children, providing for them physically, spiritually. Children must bear the burden of honoring their aged parents. So there are burdens we must bear, and there are burdens that a person must bear on their own. And so we need to be careful, because burden bearing can reach a point where it becomes enabling. If you've got an adult child who lives at home and is capable, but chooses not to work and does nothing but sitting around in the room playing video games all day, but the parent continues to support them and feed them and not give them any responsibility, hey, it reaches a point that this becomes enabling, okay? And so it takes wisdom to discern what are burdens that we can help others bear and what are burdens that others have to bear on their own, okay? And so we must be careful that we don't become a partaker in that process of someone else's sin. We must apply wisdom and know when to step up and help, and when to step back and allow someone to bear a burden that is their own responsibility. And then finally, we need to realize that the small things are actually the big things. When it comes to bearing one another's burdens, oftentimes we think of someone who's dealing with some sort of major traumatic situation, A moment of crisis or hardship, like a major illness or the loss of a loved one or a divorce, and stepping up in those moments and helping them bear those burdens. Most of the burdens we bear, though, I think, are much smaller, much less significant, at least, but no less significant, but seemingly smaller. In Matthew chapter 25, 31 through 40, you've got Jesus had the sheep on the right hand, who were going to enter into life. He says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and in prison and you came and visited me. And they said, when did we do all these things for you, Jesus? And he says, when you did it for the least of my brethren, you did it for me. The most significant things are often the smallest, and these people seem to have forgotten about them. Burden bearing is not a front and center job. It's not one that's going to get you in the spotlight. It's often done, and the only one who knows it's been done is the one who's been helped and the helper. But with that being said, it's not an overlooked job. 1 Timothy 5:25, Paul says, so also good works are conspicuous. So certain good things you can do will go unnoticed. And even those that are not cannot remain hidden. So there's things that you can do to help others that can be seen and known by everybody. But there's going to be good things that we do, bearing burdens that are often going to go unnoticed by others. But they're not going to remain hidden. Why? Because the Lord knows. Nothing escapes His notice. In Hebrews 6:10, God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love you've shown for His name in serving the saints as you still do. And so what you find out is it's really the small things, the day-to-day things that we come alongside one another in that are going to translate to be the truly weightier burdens when life is over. And so I hope we'll all resolve to be better burden bearers, not just for our brethren, but for those who don't know the Lord, because the world's full of broken and hurting people, not just in the church, but out in the world. And there's always going to be a shortage of burden bearers, but there'll never be a shortage of burdens. So let's resolve to be better burden bearers, knowing that in doing so, we fulfill the law of Jesus. We lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven, and we minister to Jesus Himself in these things. So maybe someone's here this morning and you're bearing the burden of sin. You're bearing the guilt of unforgiveness. Well, here's the gospel. Here's the good news. Jesus is the ultimate burden bearer. And so maybe you need to come and take that burden off your back and allow Him to help you. Because it was said about Him in Isaiah 53:4. Surely He has carried our sorrows and He has bore our grief. And what did Jesus say while He was on the earth? But come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Maybe you're here this morning and your soul needs rest. Burden's light because Jesus bore the burden to Calvary and now He walks beside us. And coming forward it's gained a wrong connotation through the years. It's been associated with shame and weakness, and when in actuality it should be seen as a sign of strength. But because it takes a person of strength to say, I've got difficulties, I've got sin, I've got hardships and challenges, I can't do this anymore on my own. And so we shouldn't look at the front row as a place of shame, but rather we should look at it as a place of strength. Truth be told, we should probably all be up here way more often than we are. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. You need to respond to the invitation by coming, casting your load on Jesus, who has borne your sin to Calvary. Make that change this morning by coming in faith, dying with Him in baptism. Maybe you're here and you're bearing burdens and you need help. That's why we're here. We want to help you bear that. If anyone needs to respond, would you come forward as we stand?